Spencer, I'm not going to start the program this week by asking how you're doing because I think I already know the answer to that. A day that everybody knew was coming at some point, but everyone dreaded and hoped would never get here has arrived. Legendary Brewers broadcaster Bob Uecker passing away early on Thursday morning at age 90, a little over a week shy of his 91st birthday. This may be the toughest day in franchise history, and that's a pretty loaded statement to lead this show off with. But I think it's true, and I think most people would agree. Bob Uecker, to put it pretty simply, was this franchise. He was around for
Yep.
the entirety of this franchise. The first year that he started broadcasting was in 1971 for the Brewers. Their first season in Milwaukee as the Brewers was 1970. 54 years in the booth, called the Brewers' last game of the 2024 season, and that ultimately would be his last game as a broadcaster. Welcome back to the Brewer Fanatic podcast. Jack Stern and Spencer Michaelis with you this week. And man, really all I could think about all day leading up to this is what words can you come up with right now? You know, our job for this program is to talk, and that's not very easy to do right now. Spencer, I guess before I get too carried away here, I'll just pass it over to you just for your honest feelings, your honest thoughts, kind of what the day has been like for you. I'm sure it's been a very long day for not only baseball fans in Milwaukee, but baseball fans everywhere. I mean, this guy was named Mr. Baseball for a reason, but I'll start with you. What was your reaction, and just how have you been able to process this throughout the day, if you've been able to process it? Because I'm not sure it's fully sunk in yet, even at this point. We're only a few hours into this new reality of Brewers baseball.
Yeah, it was, as you said right away, it's something that you kind of know that it's at any point. Somebody's 90 years old. I mean, at any point it could happen. And that's why the fact that it hit me so hard when it happened was almost even more difficult. It felt like losing a family member. Like, this is somebody who you grew up with. It's somebody that he announced games my entire life. As you mentioned, he announced games for double the amount of my entire life to this point. My dad grew up on Bob Uecker. Like, it's crazy the impact he has had on the Brewers, as you mentioned, on baseball as a whole. But my initial reaction was to try not to let any tears fall down my face while I was sitting at my work desk. I mean, for the record, for anyone who doesn't know me, if you do know me, I'd be considered a crier. I'm not somebody who's very ashamed of it. I'll cry for good things. I'll cry for bad things. So when stuff like this happens, I will absolutely cry. And I'm going to do my best not to do that on video for you guys. But if you're watching and it happens, I apologize, but I don't really. You meant so much to everything about my baseball career, really. I mean, my dad was the one who introduced me to baseball, but I don't know if anyone outside of him fueled the fire and my passion and my love for this game more than Uecker did over the course of my life. I mean, he's been there the entire time, like I said, and I didn't have cable until probably 10 years old. So I was listening to games most of my childhood if I wasn't at the game. Even the games I could get on TV were on Telemundo, and I needed the radio to be able to get through those games and understand what was happening. And Ueck was the narrator of the Brewers for me. And I think the best way to say it is that even when he wasn't announcing, you watch the Brewer game, a lot of times you would find, or I would find myself at least, wondering how Ueck sounded during that moment and what his call was like. And like every single Brewers moment, you can almost hear Uecker's voice, even if he didn't actually make the call. It's just, he's so synonymous with the Brewers and with everything I've witnessed in my life. And he had so many great calls, and we could talk about all those forever. But just everything he meant to the city, to the state, but more than anything, he meant so much to a lot of people who never probably even heard him call a Brewers game. That's how special the impact he had is. It was a tough day. I have, like I said, I'm going to do my best to hold it in. I'm trying to smile through it right now because that helps me. But yeah, it was a weird feeling for somebody that you almost, I don't want to say expected it, but you knew it could come any day, and it still it hit so hard.
I think what's really striking about a situation like this is you mentioned, just all the memories that you had growing up listening to him call games. You mentioned how anytime there was a moment you could just picture Uecker being on the call, and that's the crazy thing. Like, if there was a moment, Uecker was almost always on the call for it. Like,
Yeah.
how many other franchises can point to having a guy who was there for almost every single franchise milestone? How many franchises can have a guy that they can point to where every single generation of that franchise has some kind of connection to him in some way? He's a core part of their baseball fandom, or the way that they've experienced this game. And I think that sits with me because, you talked about how you didn't have cable until you were 8, 10 years old, whatever you said. So you listened to games on the radio before then. That was not my experience growing up. I'm young. I grew up in the era of every single game is on TV. I really started watching baseball more intently probably once we got to around like 2011, which is when the Brewers went on that run to the NLCS. Niger Morgan, Ryan Braun, Prince Fielder, you had that core of guys. But because I grew up watching baseball closely in that era, that's when almost every game is on TV. So I didn't listen to a ton of radio when I would consume the Brewers. But still, even then, he still found a way to be an important part of my baseball fandom growing up. It's like, to me, that also points to just how good he was, how powerful this energy was that he brought to the booth, that even if you didn't listen to a lot of radio, just one way or another, whether it was through having highlights of his calls dubbed onto those video clips, or just the fact that, like, even in those moments where you do have to listen to the radio, even if they're not super common, especially compared to watching on TV, if those moments and those experiences still stick with you even more than all the games that you watched on TV. And I would say that's the case for me. Like I said, I watched most of the games on TV when I was coming up through like middle school and beyond, and high school. But there were still moments where I'd listen to him on the radio, especially if we were, like up north on a family vacation during the summer. If we were driving up during a game, he would be on the radio in the car. Once we got up there at night, just sitting around a fire with your family,
Yep.
AM radio is perched up right next to my chair. Bob Uecker's voice is coming out of that AM radio. Even like when I was in high school and I'm working my mundane after school high school job, a lot of ways that I would get through those shifts was I would pop an earbud in and I'd listen to the game on the radio. That's really where I listened to him the most, actually. And in a way, looking back now, I'm glad I had to work a crappy high school job, because if I hadn't, then just thinking of how many opportunities to listen to Bob Uecker that would have deprived me of if I didn't have, a job where that was the only way I could listen to some games at night. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to put into words, but to me, it's always striking the fact that he has some kind of impact on basically everybody who's been a Brewers fan at any point in time. And I think that really just speaks to how good he was at his job, how unique he was. He had such a unique way of calling a game, the way that he could maintain like this conversational style. He could hold a full conversation, be telling a full story, and just seamlessly mix in enough game updates that like you still knew exactly what was going on
Yeah.
in the game, especially when he was in his prime. You knew exactly what was going on in the game. And at the same time, you were completely engrossed in whatever story he's telling, or you're laughing at whatever joke he's setting up. And some of the jokes he would tell too, that there would be like some big buildup and big exposition before he gets to the punchline. Like these weren't only one-liners that he would be throwing into broadcasts, although he would do that sometimes too. He was very quick on his feet, very witty. But yeah, still a core memory, even though I didn't listen to him a lot, or not nearly as much as maybe some other people growing up who radio was their primary form of consuming Brewer games. But like even for me when I was a kid, like playing wiffle ball in the front yard, every time I'd hit a home run, if I wasn't running around the bases yelling in like a Bob Uecker impersonation, get up, get out of here, gone, I could still hear his voice in my head, making the call as I'm rounding the bases. And I think a lot of kids had that same experience or experienced the same thing when they were younger. So it's cool to think back on that. And, I've seen some really good stories out today from other members of the Brewers media talking about their experience with him. And I'm not going to pretend that I have the treasure trove of stories or experiences that they do, because this was only my first year on the beat. And he was still around plenty, but again, he wasn't around quite as often as he used to be in his final season, which makes sense now once we kind of get into some of the health stuff he was dealing with. But still, I got to meet him. I shook his hand at one point. And more striking is the fact that even if you're not interacting with him directly, being in the same clubhouse with him a few times, being in the same dugout as him a few times, you could tell that every time he walked into that clubhouse, he like absorbed all the air in that clubhouse. Like every eye was on him. Everybody wanted to talk to him. And when I say like he absorbed all the air, I don't mean that in a sense of like everyone looked at him and was like, it was like he only commanded respect. Like people adored him. He was beloved in that clubhouse. And that's also why there was so much attention turned to him whenever he entered a room. So just an incredible part of Brewers baseball. He's always going to be Brewers baseball. Bob Uecker and Brewers baseball are always going to be synonymous with each other. I think in a lot of ways, he's a representation of everything that's beautiful about this game. The fact that his voice unifies generations of baseball fans, the fact that his voice basically unified an entire state around that shared experience of being able to grow up and listen to these games and listen to his calls. And I think he's also a good illustration of the fact that like this game is not only for players or for coaches. And granted, he was a former player, so he had been in those kinds of circles before. And from some of the accounts that we got from several of the people who played during his tenure with the Brewers, he kind of was a coach to them as well. But this is a guy who did not have success in a couple of different roles early in his baseball career. He wasn't a good player. He wasn't a good scout, as the infamous story goes. But he still found his place in this game, and it ended up being a very important place in this game. And just all of this stuff, I think, makes him a really good representation of everything that's great about this sport. And he's going to be missed. Mark Ananasio, one of the first things he told us today when he talked to the media this afternoon was everybody in our organization is replaceable, including me. So ownership, coaches, players, executives, all of us, even the ones who are really good at our jobs, we're all replaceable. Bob Uecker's not.
Yeah.
There's never going to be another Bob Uecker. And that's not to discredit whoever will end up calling Brewers radio games for the foreseeable future. But the point is, he was just so special. And there are so many aspects of that experience of listening to him that are just never going to be replicated. So kind of all you can do is just be grateful that you were around at the same time that he was, that you got to experience the joy that he brought to this fan base and to this city and to Major League Baseball. And yeah, just be happy you were along for the ride. And, can be sad that it's over, but you should also be happy that it happened.
Yes. Yeah. 100%. I mean, what you talked about with his ability to carry on a story, it always blew my mind that he had the ability to keep listeners around in blowouts that were going the wrong direction for Brewers fans. And I saw a lot of those stories today, but just it didn't matter sometimes. Like, there were some pretty rough years of Brewers baseball. I think everyone knows that. And a good chunk of that was when I was young enough to not have cable, and I was mostly listening on the radio to get the Brewer games. And me and my dad would just be sitting in our basement listening to Bob Uecker talk, and there were plenty of 10-2 games in those days with the Brewers, and it didn't matter. Like, it somehow didn't matter because he had you so interested in what he was saying. His ability to tell the same story probably 100 times and you never got bored of it was unbelievable. He would always seem to have some sort of twist you hadn't heard, and just the way he was as a storyteller just always kept you interested, even if, like I said, you knew how it ended. It didn't really matter. And then I just always think of some of like the really more famous ones, but I think my favorite one is always going to be him talking about the furries in Pittsburgh. I hadn't ever heard that story until I was going to Pittsburgh in 2022. And then I heard the call, and somebody told me to look it up. I did not realize that I was also going to Pittsburgh at the time of the furry convention that he was referring to. So I got to experience what he was talking about firsthand. And I mean, he nailed the experience, I can tell you that. But it was just one of those things where it was, after witnessing it, it made it an even better call, and just so many things like that. And you mentioned how when he'd walk into the clubhouse, everybody just, wanted to talk to Uke. And I always thought one of the coolest things for any part of the Brewers organization and any part of baseball was the fact that all these low to mid 20s guys were calling an 80-plus-year-old guy this whole time a friend. Not like, oh, somebody I love being around Uecker, I love spending time with the guy. It was, no, he is a friend of mine. Like, there is a up to 60, 70-year difference in some of these guys' ages, and they viewed him as just, this guy is my friend, and I care about him. That came through very clearly on social media today with how many former players and current players posted just stories or just, anything to kind of honor Uke and how much he meant to them. So that stuff was always very cool to me. And I think back to a story that Norm Macdonald told once, one of my favorite comedians, and it's always cool to me that those two overlapped. It doesn't surprise me. I think they have similar humor in some ways, but he told a story about John Fogerty and Uecker, and most of you have heard that story. I'm not going to repeat the story, but there was one part in it where he just said, Bob views everyone as a normal person. He meant it more in terms of like, there's no celebrities. There's not like, everyone's just a normal person. But I think over the course of his entire life, he showed that he could connect with people from all different walks of life. And that's impressive for anybody, but I think it's even more impressive for somebody who grew up in the time that he grew up. I mean, it was a very different time when he was growing up, and like, he just connected with everybody as human beings, as people. And that was always one of the most impressive things to me. I mean, even just for the Brewers, so many of the foreign players, Freddie Peralta, Orlando Arcia, Willie Adames, like those guys, Carlos Gomez, all these guys just had maybe even some of the most special connections with Uecker. It seems like the way they talk about him and rave about him. And I mean, Freddie has basically called him one of his best friends before. And again, there's a 60+ year difference here. And that type of stuff, along with what he did in baseball, which was not to be overlooked. Bob Uecker was a good announcer. I think maybe nationally people just kind of viewed him as, a guy who was really funny and kept people entertained, but he was good at his job. Now, obviously, as he got older, there were things that would slip through the cracks and everything else, but Bob Uecker was a very good announcer who also was very funny at the same time and could keep you entertained with stories. There's nobody like him. Like you said, I don't think there will ever be anyone like him again in sports. People will try, and frankly, I think a lot of announcers have tried to emulate Uecker now over the years. He was the first guy to kind of bring humor to sports announcing. Based on what I have heard, he kind of changed things in that regard, because before it was call the game, just tell them what's happening and that's it. And Uecker made it a lot more personal. He made it something where it's you feel a connection, and that's why for me it feels like losing a family member today, because I felt like I know him. You got to meet him a couple times, or at least you crossed paths with him. I never met Bob Uecker, and yet it still feels like I did, and I knew him on a personal level. And that's hard to do. That's impressive, and that's what made him so special. So it was a tough day. It was a tough day. It's gonna be an empty feeling. And again, like you mentioned, that's not to put unneeded pressure on whoever takes the spot or whoever is, doing more radio work. But nobody can be Bob Uecker. They shouldn't have to try to live up to it. They're not going to. Nobody will. But it was a tough day, and he was just a special dude that you don't get guys like that. I think it was Murph and Yelich who both said, or at least paraphrasing very similarly, they said saying he's one of a kind feels like an understatement, and it does. I mean, that one hit me, I will say, when I saw Yelich's post. That was one of the times I started tearing up pretty good at work. So yeah, it's a perfect way to say it. It does. It feels like an understatement for a guy like that.
On that note you brought up a couple minutes ago about him being both a good broadcaster and a good entertainer, one of the themes that I saw come up several times throughout the day was he was absolutely good enough at both of those things that he could have gone basically any direction he wanted to. In his career, he could have taken a job to be an announcer for a bigger market team. He could have gone fully into the entertainment industry and taken like the actor and comedian route. He did neither one of those things. And if he ever did kind of venture out beyond Milwaukee, it was always secondary to what he perceived to be his main job. This is a guy who called games here, again, for 54 years. And for almost every single one of those years, he did it on a handshake agreement with the owner.
Yep.
As opposed to signing like a contract with actual stipulations in it. Like, he cared that deeply about this city and about this team and about this franchise, about the fans, about the players, about the coaches, about everybody. And he stayed here for the entirety of a really storied career. And that's something that's going to stick with people too. And even beyond that, like, this was a guy who played here too before that. He was from here.
Yeah.
Like, everything about him is Milwaukee. In addition to being Milwaukee baseball, everything about him is Milwaukee. It is Wisconsin. And I think we've seen pretty clearly that resonates with a lot of people, not only in this state, but just in the Midwest in general, I think.
Yeah.
It is kind of like the smaller, down-home region of the country. And I think if you prove to those people that, your roots are here and you're always going to be loyal to them, and you're going to be one of us, I think that's something that really is just going to add to your legacy, and I definitely think that's the case for him. Now that we've kind of got those sentiments voiced, I want to transition to number one, just some information about kind of how we got here, and number two, some of the comments we got from Mark Ananasio, from players who played when Uecker was here. I spent most of the afternoon doing the media availability calls with these folks, and they were very gracious with all the stories that they told. I mentioned the quote from Ananasio about how Bob Uecker's irreplaceable. And it was also just striking to hear him talk about just the fact that he saw him not only as a colleague, but like as a close friend. And he talked about the relationship that Uecker had with his family. And that was really just kind of a theme across this whole thing. Nobody talked about him like, oh, he was really fun to work with. In fact, I don't think I heard anybody the entire afternoon say anything about working with him. I don't think I ever heard anything phrased that way. It was always about the relationship, like the personal relationship, the interpersonal relationship that all of these people had with him. But basically, what happened in this situation was Bob Uecker was battling single cell lung cancer since 2023. He had several, health scares before that, but this one was ultimately the final one that he would have to endure. There were very few people that knew about this, even within the organization. Bob Uecker was very tight-lipped about it. He didn't want it to become a big thing. So even within the Brewers organization, he only told a small handful of people. None of this was public knowledge until his family revealed it earlier this morning in the statement that they gave earlier on Thursday morning, I should say, in the statement they gave. Christian Yelich and Brandon Woodruff did tell us this afternoon that they were among the very few individuals who knew that this was a diagnosis that he had. Christian Yelich told us that he found out about it very quickly after Uecker found out about it. So he was one of the first people who Uecker mentioned it to and revealed it to, which I think, again, just speaks to how close those two got during Yelich's time here and during Uecker's final years here. But he continued to call games for the last 2 seasons. He was always very adamant about, the only way he was going to give this job up is if he felt that he couldn't do it well anymore. And, Spencer, you talked about like some things are going to slip through the cracks as you get older. But it never did reach that point where you felt like they have to get him off the air.
No.
Like he was right. I mean, he said he was going to do this until he couldn't. He could still do it.
Mm-hmm.
And there were still some very good and very distinct, memorable calls that he was able to give during those final couple of years. But he was still very dedicated to this job. And, I think that if you were around the team this year, like some of us had the benefit of being, I think there was kind of just this growing vibe that he was nearing the end of the line, that this experience, this partnership between him and the Brewers was winding down. He was still around plenty at the ballpark this year, but it was always kind of touch and go which games he was going to be able to call at home. I know Jeff Levering and Lane Grindle, his radio partners, they would show up for every single home game prepared to call the game. And if he showed up and said he wanted to do it, great. If not, he could take the day off and just relax a little bit. But he did still show up pretty often, called a lot of games this year. He called the final game of that wild card series. But I think just from that, you could kind of tell that, okay, he's starting to wind down a little bit at least. And then once you got to the aftermath of that wild card game 3, when we got down to that clubhouse, one of the first things we saw was Bob Uecker making the rounds, talking to everybody, handshakes, hugs, tears were being shed. Could tell there were some very emotional conversations happening. And I hadn't been in the clubhouse for past playoff losses, so I have nothing to compare it to, but it seemed like that emotion was always rooted in something more than just losing that playoff game, as heartbreaking as that was for all of the people in that room. I think you could tell there was something more going on. Some of the comments from Christian Yelich and just kind of the state that he was in after that conversation, you could tell that something was going on. And then Yelich ended up revealing to us today that, yeah, I knew about this diagnosis. And that last conversation in the clubhouse was hard because, it wasn't said directly, but, we kind of knew deep down like that was it. He's probably not going to call another Brewer game again. That was probably the last ride for him. Our last opportunity to make a deep playoff run and to have him around for that.
Yeah.
And that's tough. But still, it was still fun to hear some of the stories these guys had about him and to hear how impactful he was on this organization. One of my favorite anecdotes actually came from Brandon Woodruff today, and he said that when the Brewers were going through rough patches in recent years, whether it was under Craig Counsell or under Pat Murphy this year, sometimes when they were in a rut, instead of calling a team meeting and, Counsell leads the thing, Murphy leads the thing, they would call a team meeting, and Council or Murphy would bring Bob Uecker into the room, and Uecker would run the show for a little bit and just try to rally the troops. And from all accounts, it seems to have worked whenever they would go that route, and that doesn't surprise me in the slightest. But that kind of comes back to what I was talking about before, just how he was like a coach to these guys in a way. But he was also like one of them, like you talked about. Like he could relate to them, not just in this way of, oh, I respect this guy because, I know what he's been through and he's got more experience than me. Like, no, like they also respected him as an equal, like they could treat him like they would treat,
Yeah.
a fellow 25 to 30-year-old player. And he just fit right in with that group. And, he was always part of the clinching celebrations. That was another thing Woodruff said too. He said his favorite pictures on his phone are the selfies that he would make sure to take with Bob Uecker for every clinch celebration whenever the Brewers were going to the postseason. Ryan Braun said that, there's a reason why he was always in the middle of those celebrations. We didn't want to start these celebrations without him. Christian Yelich said something similar. We wanted him to be right in the middle of this because he was such a big part of it for us. So, just really cool to hear some of those stories. And that's the only positive from today, I think, just being able to spend most of the day hearing some of these stories, some of these anecdotes, and just seeing how many people he reached and how big a part of this organization he was in so many different facets. I feel like that's pretty rare for a broadcaster to have that kind of influence, that kind of
Yeah.
respect, those kinds of relationships with guys. It's something special, and it might be something that we never see again, whether it's for this franchise specifically or for any franchise in Major League Baseball. It's pretty special stuff.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And like you said, the one positive from this day was getting to hear some stories we'd never heard about Uecker, which you don't get too many of those. People like to tell their Uecker stories for good reason. They're always very good stories. But a lot of former players, just a John Axford tweet today about what Uecker talked to him about after he blew out his elbow in the one game he returned to Milwaukee a few years back. And I think the one thing I do look back on positively, not the one thing, but one of the biggest things that I look back on positively for the Brewers and just how everything has been handled the last decade or so, it felt like the Brewers made a very concerted effort to make sure Uecker was getting his flowers at any given point publicly. And it sounds so simple, but there are so many legends that do pass and they weren't given that type of love publicly. Like obviously everyone internally loved Uecker, all the fans loved Uecker, but it seemed like the social media presence and everything else, they wanted to make sure everybody understood how loved he was and making sure he got his flowers before this day would come. I think that was really important. Hopefully it helped him understand just how much he means to so many people. Yeah, the stories were the one thing that probably got me through the day more than anything else, was getting to kind of laugh or smile about some of the stories people were telling and just getting to be able to be put back in that spot where Uecker's being him. But yeah, it was, I'm running out of words for him, mostly because I just don't think you can ever do justice to what he brought to every part of my life and so many Brewers fans' lives.
I think there's more that both of us could say that maybe neither one of us can fully articulate at the moment. So, again, rest in peace to Bob Uecker. Not just a major part of Brewers baseball for over 50 years, he was Brewers baseball for 50 years. And even after passing away, he'll still be synonymous with Brewers baseball for the rest of this franchise's history. A great career, a great person, someone whose legacy will never be forgotten in Milwaukee or across the sport. With that, we are going to try to transition to some other Brewers topics. We had a discussion about how we were going to go about this once this news came out, and I think the consensus from several of us in this sphere of Brewers media is that Bob Uecker was someone who was not really always big on all the attention or all the accolades he received. He was very passionate about this game, and as much as I was leaning earlier in the day towards just talking about this and cutting it off there, he's probably someone who would rather we get back to actually discussing baseball because that's where his passion was. So again, we tried our best to do a little tribute here for the first half hour of the show, but we'll try to move on to business as usual here for the rest of the episode. The big news for the Brewers is that they recently settled with all but one of their arbitration eligible players. William Contreras is the only one who does not have a contract for 2025. Before we go into that a little bit more, we'll just kind of bring up what each of the other arbitration eligible players settled for ahead of that filing deadline. So if you're watching on video, we are going to have the figures pulled up here on the screen. And if you're listening on audio, we can just run through them really quickly. So Nestor Cortez settled for $7.6 million. That's just a little bit short of the $7.7 million projection from MLB Trade Rumors. We'll be comparing what they said to what these players got as well. But again, just for the most part, the takeaway here is their formula is very, very accurate. Very, very good. Aaron Savali settled for exactly $8 million on the dot. That's exactly what the projection was for him. While Pyamp's getting $2.995 million, the projection for him was $2.8 million. Eric Haas, if you remember, a few months ago, he actually signed a deal to avoid arbitration. So the Brewers turning down the option they had on him and then just giving him a new deal to cover 2025. So he'll again make $1.35 million. His projection for arbitration was $1.8 million. So a couple thousands worth of savings there. Trevor McGill is going to make $1.94 million. His projection was $2 million. Nick Mears is going to make $963,000. His projected base salary for 2025 in ARB was $900,000. And then you have William Contreras, who is most likely going to an ARB hearing over contested figures that are not especially close to the projection for him. And Spencer, I know you raised a point about this that I'm probably in agreement on. So Contreras filed at $6.5 million. The Brewers countering at $5.6 million. The MLB Trade Rumors projection for him was $7.6 million.
Yeah.
And I'll let you give your thought here on what you think happened, because it always seemed like a kind of a high projection at the time, and now it looks really high, seeing as neither side filed for particularly close to that dollar amount.
Yeah, to me, it just kind of screams typo. I mean, the other catchers who we'll talk about in a few minutes here, but the most comparable catchers to Contreras to this point in their career at the same kind of time in their career here are Cal Raleigh and Adley Rutschman, and their projections were both, I don't have it up in front of me right now, but they were both in the about 5.5 to 5.9 million range. And then William was 2 million higher basically than what those two were getting. And again, we'll get into some of the comparables, and we've talked about how arbitration works a little bit before, but I'm sure we'll dive into that a little bit more. It's a comp-based system basically, and the closest to 7.6 is the Buster Posey record-breaking number, which was coming off of an MVP year. And yeah, it just feels like it doesn't make sense. And like Jack said, they're very good at this. So the fact that they would be that far off from even what William is asking for, like you noted, it just feels like it had to have been some sort of entry error, because I don't know what would have led to that high of a number. Now I could see them have maybe going 6.6 million and saying they view him as better than Raleigh or Rutschman or whatever their formula is, maybe doing that. But it feels really hard for me to see anything that would have led them to put $2 full million over those two, when so much of their career has been very, very comparable to this point. So it just, to me, it screams typo.
We're going to now discuss this case more specifically with Contreras. So we went over kind of what everyone ended up settling at. All these players will be back with the Brewers. Everything's A-okay with them. I shouldn't say they'll be back with the Brewers. The Brewers could still trade any of these players. We don't know if Aaron Savali's still going to be around. Maybe he's still someone who they might try to shop and see if they can reallocate that $8 million. But the bottom line is all of these other players have their contracts set in stone for 2025.
Yes.
There's not going to need to be any hearings or anything to determine how much money they're going to make. The Brewers and Contreras, again, are the only ones out of all of Milwaukee's arbitration eligible players who did not reach an agreement. So you're going to notice here, 6.5 million, 5.6 million, $900,000 is what we're talking about here in the difference. That does not seem like a lot. It's similar to the seemingly minor difference that the Brewers had with Corbin Burns a few years ago, where they were only off by a few $1,000s. It was under $1 million.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about this a little bit before, but we're going to run through the entire process again because I understand why people get frustrated by this. I understand why people don't get it because it's a little tricky to wrap your head around if you haven't looked into this deeply or if you haven't been covering a baseball team, which kind of forces you to know the ins and outs of this a little bit. So the first thing I'm going to say here is your starting point for understanding this is you cannot think about this in the same way that you would think about free agency.
No.
How players get compensated in free agency. It's not remotely the same thing. It's an entirely different system. So any preconceived notions you have about, players earning money or getting paid what they deserve, you got to throw those out the window because this is an entirely different system. It's not based on any of the same factors whatsoever. All of the context is different. When you're a free agent, you can negotiate with all 30 MLB teams and you can take whichever contract you like the most. That gives you a pretty good amount of leverage as a free agent because you can pit other teams against each other. And basically the bidding will go as high as any team is willing to pay you. And, depending on who's all interested, it's almost guaranteed that if you are a good player, you're going to have a lot of teams bidding against each other for your services. In arbitration, you don't have that. Nobody's bidding against anyone. You're still going to be on that team no matter what. It's just a matter of how much are they going to have to pay you. And have to pay you is kind of the key here too, because we've seen an increasing sentiment among teams that they're not going to do any more than they have to because they have this system set up for them. But whereas free agency is based on open negotiations with any team you want, and that allows you to you don't have full control over your market, but you have pretty good control over your market, and your production is going to have much fairer control over your market than what you're going to get in arbitration. In free agency, you got a pretty good chance at being paid market value or at least somewhat close to it. In arbitration, you're not getting paid market value because there is no market. The way that arbitration works is all the compensation, everything, these figures that you're realistically able to attain for a salary bump, it's all based on precedent. It's not based on open negotiation. It's based on precedent. So if you're William Contreras and you're the Brewers, you're filing for these numbers based on precedent. Like, of course, William Contreras is worth $6.5 million. He knows he's worth more than that. The Brewers know he's worth more than that. If you're going to go by like the estimates at Fangraphs, he was worth like $45 million, excuse me, in 2024. Everybody knows that, but that's not what we're talking about here. So when Contreras files for $6.5 million, that's not him saying, well, I'm going to try to give the Brewers a deal here, and why wouldn't they take that? That's not what this is about. William Contreras knows he's worth way more than that. His representation knows he's worth way more than that. But his representation also knows that based on precedent and comparing him to other players who have been at a similar point in their careers with similar production, entering their first arbitration season as a catcher, he's probably not going to win a case in which he files for more than this. And that's because when you look back at the historical earnings for catchers in their first year of arbitration, like Spencer said, the all-time record for the most money a catcher has made in his first arbitration season is Buster Posey at $8 million. And Buster Posey, when he signed that $8 million deal, it was a deal to avoid arbitration.
Mm-hmm.
But still, it counts the same because it was a deal that he signed. It was the raise he got in that first arbitration eligible season. To get that amount of money in his first year of ARB, he was coming off arguably the best season of all time for a catcher. He hit 336 that season. He had a 164 weighted runs created plus, 9.8 FWAR. So by wins above replacement, at least the Fangraphs version, and if you're going to evaluate catchers, you should use Fangraphs WAR or Baseball Prospectus WAR. Don't use Baseball Reference WAR because they're not good at evaluating catching defense. These other versions of WAR are good at evaluating catcher defense, so they're a much better representation of how valuable a catcher actually is, because defense is really the name of the game if you're a catcher. It's a glove first position. But Buster Posey, that 9.8 FWAR, that is the highest all time in the history of the game in a single season for a catcher. So he was coming off arguably the best catcher season of all time when he went into his first year of arbitration. And the deal he got was $8 million. That was the raise he got. He went up to $8 million the following season. William Contreras, for as good as he's been, he has not been nearly as good as Buster Posey was that year. William has basically been like a 5.5 win player in each of these last two seasons. So the number that he's filing for is short of Posey, but it would be the second highest first year arbitration salary for a catcher in big league history behind Buster Posey. So basically what Contreras is doing here is he's trying to set a new salary precedent for catchers of his caliber in their first year of arbitration. Because again, Posey you can't really use as a comparison because he was basically he almost like got the same amount of value in that 2012 season in that 1 year as Contreras has had the last 2 years.
Yeah.
Not quite double, but it's pretty close. So basically, consider Contreras like the next tier down from that. And this number that he's filing for, this would be a record for a catcher of his tier. So like in that like if you put Posey in like the number 1 tier and then Williams in the number 2 tier, you can basically consider this like the new first year arbitration record for a tier 2 catcher. If you look at all the other catchers who came before him who were kind of in that similar tier, so we're talking about, like Matt Wieters was an example.
Mm-hmm.
J2 Real Muto wasn't quite at the level that William was when he went through ARB, and he's a little bit below then. But Matt Wieters is a good example. I know I wrote about this in more detail. I don't have the other examples off the top of my head because this was a couple weeks ago. But if you look at those kinds of catchers, they've basically kind of like been stuck in exactly the range that the Brewers filed for like the last 10 plus years. So a catcher who's been about as good as Contreras when he goes through arbitration in his first season, they've almost always in these last 10 years, they've gotten basically between like 5 million and 5.5 million. Now that 5.6 number is really significant because Spencer mentioned Cal Raleigh before. That is exactly the dollar amount that Cal Raleigh settled with the Mariners earlier in the day of the filing deadline. And that 5.6 million, if memory serves, the previous high was like 5.5.
Yep.
So Raleigh bumped it up $1,000 with what he got in that agreement there. And technically right now, that is, let's call it like the first year record for a tier 2 catcher. The Brewers, not coincidentally, filed for that exact amount. So basically what they're doing here is they're saying, yeah, we know you're really good. So what we're going to do is we are going to match the record basically for a catcher who is as good as you entering his first year of arbitration, but we are not going to go a penny higher. And the reason they're drawing that line in the sand is because, and this is the not so fun part where we get to talk about it, arbitration is a way for teams to, yes, give players a raise, but in another sense, it's basically a way that they can still suppress salaries.
Yeah.
And every team does this. Because arbitration is rooted in precedent, if you can keep guys from setting new records or setting new baselines whenever possible, most of the time you're basically just kind of able to keep that baseline where it's at without it growing. And if you look at those catchers over the last 10 years, that's basically what teams have been able to do. Now, we've had some exceptions in recent years, but you're talking about guys like Juan Soto going through arbitration, Shohei Ohtani going through arbitration. Those are just incredibly rare players to begin with. Like, of course, they were going to set records because, I mean, they really had, there's like very few historical comps for them because they're so good. So they were able to kind of, break through the system a little bit and make like $30 million by their final arbitration seasons. That's not going to happen here, though. Like, there have been players like William Contreras before. There have been players like Cal Raleigh before. So every MLB team is going to try to keep them like in that same salary stratosphere. So what happens here is if the Brewers win this case, basically everything stays kind of status quo in terms of catcher compensation, specifically compensation for catchers that are like at William Contreras's or Cal Raleigh's level. If Contreras wins his case, or if the Brewers just give in and give him that $6.5 million, that now becomes the new baseline.
Yep.
So really, when we're talking about, it's $900,000, what are you doing? Really, this has nothing to do with $900,000, and it really has nothing to do with William Contreras either. What this is about is saving, compounding millions of dollars for basically every single team down the line, because this means that the next William Contreras, whether he plays for the Brewers, whether he plays for someone else, whatever, if William Contreras couldn't get more than $5.6 million, it means that the next William Contreras is probably not getting more than $5.6 million. If William Contreras gets $6.5 million, that means that the next William Contreras is going to get at least that, and probably he's going to try to raise the bar a little more. So basically, teams are adopting now kind of this hardline stance. They've gone like file and trial with these kinds of guys. Basically, if you are trying to set a new benchmark in arbitration for a player of your caliber in this era of baseball, you're almost guaranteed to go to an arbitration hearing, because a team is not going to let that happen unless they're basically forced to by the panel of arbitrators who are ruling on the case. So this is kind of, what you need to think about. It's a little bit to wrap your head around, but that's kind of the way it works. And this is basically exactly what the Brewers did with Corbin Burnes. The reason the Brewers did not want to give Corbin Burnes the extra few $1,000s he was asking for is because he filed for an amount that would have set the record for a second-year arbitration starter of his caliber, and the Brewers were not going to let that happen. And again, it really isn't about the Brewers just saving money for this year. That really doesn't have a whole lot to do with it. It's really not about that player specifically. That doesn't have a whole lot to do with it. It's not even just the Brewers. It's just every team in baseball is going to want to keep the status quo. If you just think about this from a business perspective, and this is where it sucks because I wish this wasn't the way it was, but this is just kind of the reality of it. If you're a businessman, you're trying to do things almost always as cost efficiently as possible. If you have a system in place that allows you to do that, why would you intentionally uproot the system?
Right.
When you don't have to? Like, and if you look at these ARB cases too, like teams, especially nowadays, like they're winning a significant majority of the time. And I would imagine the Brewers feel pretty good about their case against Contreras, which we'll get to in a minute here. So teams are going file and trial here. The Brewers did it with Burnes and they won. They're going to do it with Contreras. We'll get to the case. I think Contreras has a chance, but I think the Brewers are going to win. And we'll talk about the comp. But that's kind of why they're doing what they're doing here. With Josh Hader, the difference was it was a bigger difference in what the two sides filed for, but it was still the same thing. Like Hader filed for what would have been a record dollar amount for a first-year arbitration reliever. So when you're looking at the fact that the Brewers settled with everybody but William Contreras, the theme you're going to notice here is the Brewers want to settle with guys. They don't want to fight over money here because it's not pretty. It's not good. But when push comes to shove, if the choice is between we're not going to fight over money and go to a hearing and, kind of think about the interpersonal aspect of it, that is important to the Brewers. But just knowing how beneficial this system is for teams and knowing that the Brewers are in the smallest market in baseball, and the smallest market in baseball is never going to reset the market in any area of this sport. They're just not, for both for themselves, but also, if we're being honest here, probably just for their relations with other teams.
Yep.
Like, the Brewers just are not going to be the ones to set that bar. So if push really comes to shove and they're in a position where this player wants to set a new bar, they're going to take him to arbitration. It's a tough decision for them. I don't think they like doing this, but just from a business standpoint, this is more important to them. It just is. It's a product of the way the system works. Every team does it. I mean, with the story I wrote, I had a list about a list of other teams who are taking players to arbitration, sometimes even over less than the difference that we have here.
Oh, yeah.
With the Brewers and Contreras. I'm going to see if I can find it, but I know like the Dodgers are doing it with someone. The Yankees are doing it with someone. Yep. The Red Sox are doing it with Jarren Duran, who's coming off like an almost 9-win season. They're trying to save like $500,000 because they don't want him to set a new baseline. Like, everybody does this, even the big market teams who always get a lot of credit for spending so much money, because this is an entirely different system.
Yeah. The Dodgers are going over 300,000 and the Yankees over 450,000. I don't have the players in front of me, but
that's even less than what we have here.
Yes. And then Duran, like you mentioned, he had an even better season than Contreras, and they're going over 500,000. It's not a Brewers thing. It's a baseball thing. It's a gross system. I don't think anybody on either side even debates that. I don't think anyone likes the arbitration system, but they have not come up with a better alternate to this point to at least somewhat fairly reward the players who perform better than others as they go through their arbitration years. This is as close as they've been able to come. So right now, this is the system, and the Brewers treat it just like every other team. I think that's really important for people to keep in mind, because it doesn't, I'm sure, feel like it. And it's happened, of course, to be now 3 pretty big names for the Brewers and their fan base, obviously, with Hader and Burns and now Contreras, but they're not doing anything out of the norm. As Jack kind of mentioned, there's an expectation around the league for teams to do this as well. I don't think it would completely ruin relationships, but there are some teams that if you went out and you just handed out these contracts and willingly upped all of these baselines, like Jack talked about, they would have a problem with that, and they might not be as willing to negotiate in trades or willing to work with you as on certain things. Like, there's an expectation league-wide for everybody to do their best to keep the salaries around where they are at that moment. And like I said, it's kind of gross. It's not the best in like an ideal world, but for the world that we live in, it's the best they're able to come up with. So I don't think it's going away anytime soon. And it's just kind of how it goes. And I can promise, we've heard Matt Arnold talk about it. They don't like going to these hearings. They don't want to go and have to basically talk bad about their players and oftentimes in front of their players. But if it's what has to be done, it's what has to be done. And every franchise is willing to do it if it comes to that.
And this is kind of an unfortunate byproduct of producing the kind of star players that the Brewers have produced at some of these positions in recent years, because when that happens, that almost guarantees that guy is so good that he's going to try to file for a record-setting number, which means that you're going to fight that because you're trying to keep the system in place just like every other team is. And I should be very clear here that, like, I'm not pointing fingers at teams and accusing them of collusion here. Like, this doesn't even necessarily need to be like every team or every owner or every GM sat down in a room together and collectively schemed to keep salaries where they're at. Like, this is a conclusion that you would just arrive at naturally using like logical reasoning, knowing what's going on here and just kind of being able to put 2 and 2 together. Pretty much all of these smart people who own teams or are running teams would figure this out on their own.
Yes.
And it also doesn't take like sitting down with people and asking, well, would you be mad if we were the team that broke this? Like, you wouldn't even need to do that. It would just be kind of common sense.
Yep.
Like, of course, we're all going to do this. There doesn't even need to be a collusion or a shared discussion about it. We're just, because we're smart, savvy, shrewd baseball people and shrewd businessmen, this is an avenue by which we can pay not a penny more than we have to. So, of course,
Yep.
we're going to use it. Everyone can get to that conclusion independently. And then everyone can kind of just see for themselves, like, okay, everybody's doing this. There's going to be a ripple effect if we're the ones to break it.
Yep.
That's kind of what we're talking about when we're saying this. We're not like trying to point fingers at anyone or make accusations or make reckless accusations of something that's going on that maybe isn't. But like, just once you understand the system, kind of look at it, use some common sense. Like, everyone's going to realize this is all we're saying here. But with that in mind, we're going to look more specifically at what this case is going to look like now once it almost certainly goes to a hearing. The only way they're going to avoid a hearing here is if they sign an extension, which that's not happening. Like, if I'm William Contreras and I've performed this well on the field and I'm still in my physical prime, I'm going to be feeling pretty good about my ability to get some pretty good raises in arbitration year to year, as opposed to signing an extension that locks me into a set dollar amount. He's also going to want to hit free agency at age 30 and get, a major contract then. So, I hear some people say, well, they should just try to avoid this by extending him. I'm sure he was an extension candidate at one point, or someone for whom they wanted to buy out the ARB years. But like, guys, let's be real here. Like, unless he wants a hometown discount or is willing to take a hometown discount, he's not signing an extension. Like, this is going to have to be the way he and the Brewers go. They'll probably trade him ahead of his third ARB year, or maybe they do keep him and they kind of try to play that balance differently like they did with Willie Adames. But just to get that out of the way, he's not signing an extension. I would be shocked if they came to an agreement here, given that the Brewers filed for what would tie basically the record number for this kind of catcher. Like, they're locked into these figures.
Yeah.
And they're going to go to a hearing over it. So let's kind of look at what that hearing is going to look like. We mentioned Kyle Rowley. And again, if you're watching on the screen, we have the comparison up here on the screen. Otherwise, we'll walk through it here over audio. This is a very good case. Like, it's a very good comp for the Brewers to pick out. And basically what's going to happen in this hearing is, yes, the Brewers are going to say things about William Contreras to make him look like a worse player than he is. No, they're probably not going to actually believe most of it. They probably don't believe most of it. Or at the very least, it's not nearly as big an issue for them as they're going to let on in this hearing. But when they're making these arguments, it's not so much about trying to bash Contreras. It's more about trying to convince this panel of judges, basically, on the arbitration panel, who are going to decide which salary he makes. They're trying to convince them that he is no better than Cal Raleigh. And I think they have a pretty good case here. So we're going to run through the lines, both 2024 and their career stats, because career numbers are weighed into this as well. So in 2024, William Contreras, in 679 plate appearances, he slashed 281, 365, 466. His WRC plus was 131, and his FWAR was 5.4. Cal Raleigh in 2024, 628 plate appearances, slash line 220, 312, 436, a 117 WRC plus, so noticeably worse offensively in 2024, but 34 home runs compared to Contreras' 23, 100 RBIs compared to Contreras' 92, and then the exact same FWAR of 5.4, because Raleigh is seen as a better defensive catcher than Contreras is, especially in 2024 when Contreras took a little bit of a step back. And then we look at the career numbers. Contreras, in about 100 more plate appearances than Raleigh, he's got a 277, 358, 465 line, a 126 WRC plus, 68 home runs, 94 doubles, 239 RBIs, and 13.1 career FWAR. Cal Raleigh for his career has a 218, 296, 444, 111 weighted runs created plus, 93 home runs, 71 doubles, 251 RBIs, and 13.9 F/WAR. So basically, they're nearly identical if we break down the stats that actually have a little more weight in determining a player's value. But my guess is what the Brewers are really going to try to point to here, at least from these numbers, is Raleigh hits for more power and he drove in more runs. The other thing that sucks about arbitration is while we don't fully know what the actual system looks like, we at least have some recent cases where we know that the panel ruled based on some numbers that are basically not seen it quite as valuable as they once were. Like these are old-fashioned traditional counting stats. So RBI would be a big one. And I think Raleigh having the lead here is probably going to be something that the Brewers are hoping that panel is going to look at pretty closely, having the lead in home runs as well. Contreras has far more doubles, but if he's behind in home runs and RBI, I'm going to guess that's something that they're pushing. Raleigh is a worse hitter overall, or at least he has been, but he does have some of those counting numbers that look a little bit nicer than they do for Contreras. The other thing to think about here are accolades, and this is where Contreras does have kind of a lead on Raleigh a little bit. And this is something that the panel has been known to look at from time to time as well. Contreras is a two-time All-Star, a two-time Silver Slugger, and the last 2 seasons he's had an 11th place finish and a 5th place finish in the MVP race. Raleigh only has defensive accolades. He won the Gold Glove and the Platinum Glove as a catcher, and that has 18th and 12th place MVP finishes the last 2 years. So, Spencer, I'll kind of pass it off to you. How you think this is going to go? I just kind of ran down the case for both of these guys. How good do you think the comp is here? And then, if you had to guess, which side do you expect the ruling to be in favor of, and why?
I think it's a very good comp overall. I do wonder, just like you mentioned, we don't know exactly what goes into these decisions from the arbiter perspective, but a lot of these counting stats that they've valued in the past do seem to favor Raleigh. I'm curious. Defense, I don't know how that's factored in for catchers from their perspective. I don't know if they're going to be like, oh, he throws out a lot of runners and he didn't have many passed balls, or if they're actually getting into the metrics on that side of the ball now. I really don't know. I don't think anyone really knows where they're at, especially from the catcher perspective. So I'm going to be curious on that. I do think from Williams' perspective, I think he's got the overall better hitting numbers, like you mentioned, but I think if they do believe in those traditional stats, and I know that they started believing in on-base percentage more after the whole Moneyball thing, so he's got a pretty big jump in the on-base category now. In terms of actually drawing walks, Raleigh does it at a higher level. He just doesn't hit at the same level in terms of batting average, but I do think the accolades are going to play a role here. I think William has a case, and I don't think it's a shoo-in that the Brewers win, but if I had to guess, I do think they're going to end up coming out on top. I think they'll be able to convince the arbiters that the defense makes up for the difference in the offense, and those MVP finishes for Raleigh help because the fact that he didn't make 2 All-Star games, I think Contreras' party will argue in that favor, and the fact that he started 2 All-Star games technically, especially, they'll probably argue in his favor, but it's too similar for me to feel comfortable saying that William is going to win. I think the Brewers have a very good case, but I do think William has a pretty decent case, and I think if he ended up winning, I guess I would say I wouldn't be shocked, but my official guess would be that the Brewers would come out on top, I guess, for lack of a better term, on this one, and that the Raleigh comp would hold pretty well with the arbiters, and that would be where they would end up landing. But I really do think, like, originally I didn't even know if there'd be much of a case, but in terms of what they like, I wonder if there will be more than I was originally thinking, just because of the slash line, really, more than anything. But Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I'm going to be very interested. I think it's mostly going to come down to how they value defense and what kind of metrics they end up using on that. Because I think both sides could argue that the offense is like, oh, it's kind of a toss up. Is there a big difference in defense here? Then if they do believe that Raleigh is a lot, or I shouldn't say it's a toss up on offense. Contreras has a pretty big lead on offense, is what I mean to say. I think they could argue that point, but if the defense ends up being more of a big time advantage for Raleigh, that's where the value evens out. So I think the Brewers will end up winning it. My only other thing I'll say on this is I really hope William just does not attend the hearing. I know players don't always do that. You can attend it. A lot of agents, I should note, want players to attend it because they want players to hear what their teams are saying about them. So they're more willing to forego an extension or enter free agency because that's how agents end up getting more money. So a lot of them will encourage their players to show up at the hearings and kind of hear the teams bash them or rip on them, and to an extent. I'm hoping that's not the case here, especially since it's ARB1 and he's still going to have 2 years no matter what after this one. Hopefully the agent and him are on that same page, but we'll see. I mean, he has every right to attend and hear what they want to say. That's where it gets messy. Really, that's the only place it actually gets messy in these situations is when the player actually has to hear them say it. I don't think an agent relaying it has the same effect as the guys that you play for sitting across from you and trying to point out every negative that they can about you to try and win their case. I think that's where it can get messy from a team player perspective. Last thing I'll say, I don't think it's going to, though, get very messy here. I think William Contreras is a pretty mature guy from what we've heard. I think most players are pretty well aware of how the system works. I think everything will be fine. So I wouldn't be worried about it, but I'd feel even better about it if William Contreras did not attend the meeting at all.
I think the things that's going to come down to here for me is, can you convince this panel based on a couple of these counting stats that the gap between Contreras and Rowley is actually a lot closer to a break even than it really is?
Yeah.
I think that's what the Brewers are going to try to do. And then the defense is really interesting because I think if they're going to make any knocks on him, this is like where the case is going to be rooted in, because he did take steps back in 2024. I think the only area where he maybe got a little bit better was controlling the running game, but he still wasn't great on that front either. But the framing got way worse. The blocking got way worse. Those, again, I'm not sure how those are valued, but if the Brewers are going to try to sling some stones, those are the ones that you can actually point to that are actually accurate. And you can say, yeah, he legitimately did take steps back in this field. And if they wanted to, if they're looking at career accomplishments behind the plate, who knows? Maybe they dip as far back as, looking at how dreadful he was behind the plate with the Braves and saying, we were able to get this guy because they didn't know if he could even stick behind the plate.
Yeah.
So I think that if they're really going to try to, present his value as a little bit lower than it is, or at least like present his value as no higher than Raleigh's, I think the defense has to be a pretty big part of that. And then again, you try to argue that they're about the same offensively because, yes, Contreras has better rate stats, but Cal Raleigh's, hit more home runs and he's driven more guys in. Even though those are pretty flawed ways of assessing value, I would imagine that's going to be part of the case here. But I fully agree with you. He should not go to this. And, maybe this is a situation where, like what we talked about, what you mentioned with, agents wanting a player to not take like a team friendly extension. If there's anyone who thinks that, going to this hearing maybe wipes out that possibility. I just said a few minutes ago, I don't think he's signing an extension either way. So maybe if there was an incentive there, maybe that's now gone, like an incentive for attending this hearing. But he shouldn't, unless he is like fully prepared for what's about to happen. And I think even if like you think you're fully prepared for it, once you walk in there and you actually hear it, I think it catches you by surprise a little bit. I will say it seemed like Hader and Burns just, and I don't know this for sure, but the way they spoke about the process after they got out, it almost seems like they walked in there having absolutely no idea how this thing works.
Yeah.
And then they just seemed like almost shell shocked by it. I would imagine the more that we're seeing this happen now, maybe there is like a maybe I would hope there's kind of like a greater campaign for player awareness of what this is and how this works. We have seen some other guys for other teams approach it pretty maturely in recent years. I can't remember who it was for the Cardinals last year who went through it,
Oh yeah.
and he it wasn't Helsley, was it?
I can't remember. I know who you're talking about, but I can't think of
But
it.
someone for St. Louis went through it last year, and I remember like the clip of him talking in spring training, and I mean, you could tell he didn't like the process, but he understood it and he said the right things, and he didn't talk about it as if, like the team was personally making an attack on him or going after him or anything like that, versus when you listen to how Hader and particularly Burns, I think even Hader kind of like actually, I'm going to take back what I said about Hader. I think Hader didn't know what it was so much when he went in, but I think when he came out of it, he realized that the blame should go on the system, not on the
Hmm.
Brewers. Because I went back and read some of his comments as I was looking at this, and a lot of what he said was like, "Well, why are they evaluating me based on these things? It doesn't line up with how my team actually values me." But I never really caught him saying anything like about the Brewers as an organization or how the relationship was fractured. He was more pointing out that it's a bad system. And then he told the Brewers in turn, I'm going to pitch according to this system because I want my money. And, everyone has a different opinion on that. But like for the most part, I get why he did it. I think from a being there from your team standpoint, you probably need to be willing to make some exceptions. And he was
Yeah.
very li- like line in the sand, not going to do it. But I understand why he did it. When Burns went through it, he came out of there like guns a blazing, like the relationship is ruined. I can't believe they said all these things about me. So it did seem like he went in not fully aware of how this actually works. And maybe I'm wrong, but that was just kind of the vibe watching from afar as this whole thing unfolded. So you would hope that William has a better understanding of what this is, how it works. And again, I would say either way, don't go,
Yes.
because I think no matter what, it's going to be worse than you were expecting, even if you do have that understanding of it. But you don't know. But yeah, I would really hope that he's not going to this hearing, because again, like it's not anything that you should take personally, but that's a lot harder to do when you're sitting in the room
Hmm.
and you hear these people who you thought valued you pretty highly all of a sudden saying all these things about you and whatnot. So that's going to be the way this goes down. Just to summarize this one more time before we can finally get off this topic. It's a bad system. It does not fairly compensate players. It does not compensate them according to market value. The players should make more money if they are playing really well at this stage of their careers, but that does not change the reality that this is the system, and no single MLB team is going to say, hey, let's uproot it. That's not seen as a worthwhile business practice for them. In their mind, they have a lot more to lose by making exceptions than they do to gain. So that's why this is the way it is. It's not just a Brewers thing. This is not Matt Arnold and Mark Ananasio, huddling together in somebody's office, like rolling their hands and scheming about how they're going to save way more money than every other team in baseball. Like, that's not what's going on here. It's a bad, flawed system. But like all 29 other MLB teams, it's a system available to the Brewers. So they are going to play within the rules of that system. And that's why it is the way it is. It sucks, but just kind of the reality of the situation. And I'm sure this won't be the last time we talk about this, because I can guarantee you the Brewers are going to have somebody else in a similar spot in a few years. Final point, though, this is why signing Jackson Chourio to that extension was so
Yep.
big, because it ensures that he is not going to have to go through this process, which means the relationship between Jackson Chourio and the Brewers, it will never sour as a result of money issues like this during his initial time of control with the team. That contract extension he signed, it bought out all of his ARB years. It added on like at least 2 up to 4 years, I think, based on the options,
Yep.
because it was an 8-year. You get
Correct.
6 years of control. So it was an 8-year base deal, and then there's options on the end that can bring it up to 10. And he's also got escalators in that deal too. So like he'll get rewarded along the way if he plays well as well. Again, it still won't be close to market value if he turns into the player that I think a lot of us expect he will, but still, it's a locked in salary. There's potential to earn more money, and none of those earnings are going to be subject to this really crappy system that some of these other stars like Hader and Burns and now Contreras are going to have to go through. So hopefully that was helpful for anyone who might still be a little bit confused about the process. If anyone's got more questions, you can always tweet this at me too. Like I don't like explaining this stuff, but I think it's important that people know. So in that sense, I'm happy to do it because, you know, again, I get the frustration with it. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around, but we'll finally move out of this territory and actually focus a little more on someone who already has all of their money locked in for next year. Someone who has also previously been a star level player for the Brewers, and that's Brandon Woodruff. Adam McCalvey wrote a story at MLB.com last week talking about how Brandon Woodruff is on the mend from his shoulder surgery, didn't pitch for the Brewers at all in 2024. That was according to plan. But he is now basically back on a normal offseason ramp up. He talked to his doctor towards the end of the year and basically said, you know, his doctor cleared him for a normal offseason buildup. So in that sense, he's kind of out of the rehab phase, but not entirely. There's still a couple of guardrails that the Brewers are putting on him, but he's throwing his normal offseason bullpens twice a week. He's at roughly 30 pitches, I think just short of that at the time or at the moment. It's still TBD though if he's going to be ready for opening day. They're trying not to put like a timeline or expectations on him, and part of that is also they're not letting him, you know, pitch on a gun or get any velo readings. Basically, they don't want him chasing, I need to be ready by this date and I need to look this good by this date, and that's the smart thing to do. You just can't rush these things because, again, I think more people are doing a better job of emphasizing this now, like some other podcasts that I've listened to, some other folks in the Brewers media sphere are doing a better job of emphasizing this. But we really need to temper the expectations here. And that's not meant to be a slight against Brandon Woodruff. It's an acknowledgement of how serious and how rare this kind of surgery is and how spotty the track record is for pitchers who do have to undergo this surgery. I mean, think about how long it took Aaron Ashby to look like a big league pitcher again after he underwent major shoulder surgery. And I don't think it's not a one-to-one comparison because Ashby was never as developed as Woodruff was.
Right.
And never as experienced. So I think there's a decent chance Woodruff has a smoother, you know, recovery and buildup. But I think the point is still you just knowing how fickle these are, you can't just expect that he's going to jump right back in on opening day and be the same guy. And he already along the way has had a couple instances where he wasn't quite progressing as well as he thought he was going to be. He said overall at this stage, he's in a pretty good spot for what the original timeline was. But there were a couple of moments like at the end of the regular season where he was scheduled to throw a live BP during that final weekend series against the Mets before the wild card series. It didn't happen because his shoulder didn't cooperate and it wasn't quite in the spot where it needed to be. So he talked about how that was a little bit disappointing. But right now, he's healthy. He's throwing, he's ramping up like he normally would in the offseason. The guardrails that are still in place are basically just to prevent him from, you know, chasing being in a particular spot by a particular date in a way that could suddenly either lead to him plateauing or taking a step back or anything like that. But when this story went up last week, Adam reported that Woodruff was going down to Phoenix the following week, so the week we're recording this now, to throw in front of some Brewers evaluators in their pitching lab in Arizona. You know, the lab, the famed pitching lab that everybody likes to talk about like it's some sort of like mythical location. But he was supposed to go down there and throw. We haven't heard any updates on that since the story went up, but it's just kind of a status report on where Brandon Woodruff is at. I don't think we need to go too deep into this because I think it's pretty cut and dried. But Spencer, I know I touched a little bit on just kind of expectations for him again. I think we've talked about it before, so we don't need to go crazy. But is there anything you'd like to add on any of those fronts?
No, I was just going to reiterate that point. We've talked about it a lot, but I think as much as it can be noted, it's unfair to Brandon Woodruff to expect him to be the pitcher that he was prior to this injury, especially right away. It's it's more likely to go poorly out of the gates than it is for him to be even all that close, I would say, to what he was last time we saw him. It would obviously be awesome if that happens. I think the hope of that happening can always be there as a fan. That's something that you have every right to do. I have no problem with optimism, but I hope that we aren't getting to a point where we are expecting it or banking on it as a fan base, because that's going to lead to unfair expectations for him. It's going to put more on his shoulders. And I would imagine it would just make it even more difficult if things don't go well off the bat and he can kind of hear the noise of everybody's disappointment. So I'm not saying we have to coddle Brandon Woodruff or anything. He's a big dude. He's a strong guy. He can handle everything. But I'm just trying to make sure that we're not putting too much on him just from hope perspective, because it does start getting to a point where it's not realistic, and I think we have to kind of have a realistic look at it. It's more likely to go poorly out of the gates than it is to go super well. I'll say, last thing I'll say on this, I've mentioned it before. The one thing that makes me feel very good about Brandon Woodruff is that he has always been such a competitor that I have a feeling he's going to find a way to make it work, whether it's the same stuff he used to have or not. Again, that's not to say he would be the same type of borderline Cy Young candidate pitcher that he was before, but he seems like the type of guy who can kind of reinvent himself, and it wouldn't surprise me. Somebody who will find a way to make it work, kind of along the lines of what Wade Miley has done later in his career. I don't think it would be the exact same way. I'm just using an example of somebody who kind of reinvented himself and still made it work. And Gio Gonzalez, when he came to the Brewers, who was a totally different pitcher than he was in his prime with the Nationals. I think you could see Woodruff get to that point, but that's also something that would probably take tinkering and time, and it probably wouldn't be something you would see right off the bat, even if he does eventually get to that point. So obviously hope it'd be awesome if he's even close to what we've seen from him before, but just always trying to kind of give the reminder that it's a lot better to manage expectations. It'll save you from disappointment. It'll probably make things a little bit easier on Woodruff if he's not feeling a ton of pressure externally. And just generally, I think it's the better way to approach this whole situation.
I think I've said this before, but I'll say it one more time again here. I think if you get 100 innings out of him as like a 4 or 5 starter, I think that should be considered a win, given what he's
Huge
been
win.
through over this last year plus. Like, this is not an easy thing to come back from. And I'm sure that's not even close to what his personal goal is for the level he wants to get to. But I think that needs to be kind of the realistic expectation here, because I do think he can do that. I agree with what you said. I think he's going to work hard enough, and he's not terribly old for a pitcher either. So I think you think about those things, like, he's in his early 30s. He's a hard worker. So you combine that with the unfortunate reality that this is major shoulder surgery, and I think my take is he will find a way to reestablish himself in the big leagues in some capacity. I don't expect it to be as a frontline starter, and I don't know how long it's going to take. But like I said, I think if you get 100 innings out of him this year with maybe an ERA around 4 or a little north of 4, like, I would consider that a win. I think that's something you need to be really happy about, but we're spelling it out here because I'd be willing to guess there's a lot of Brewer fans who would consider that a disappointment.
Yes.
Instead of a win. So we're just kind of trying to remain measured here on understanding the uncertain prognosis for a guy who's had to undergo this kind of surgery, and the spotty track record for guys who tried to return. So it's a reality that you need to be aware of as we're kind of talking about projecting out Brandon Woodruff looking forward. With that, we'll move on to a couple of listener questions for the week. We have an outside chance at keeping this show under 2 hours, but I won't make any promises.
We'll see.
Maybe, well, the every other week format, I think, gives us a little more runway for kind of stretching things out a little bit. Long form Brewers discussion and analysis. That should be the tagline for this show. We do have a little bit of a theme here in some of these questions, and the theme is just general inaction from the Brewers in terms of adding major league players. So we'll start with Marcus, who asks, technically, the Brewers haven't spent any money in free agency yet. When it eventually happens, do you think it will be for a pitcher or a hitter? So just for background, the only MLB free agent contract the Brewers have signed this year has been with Grant Wolfram. But you can kind of put an asterisk next to that one because he's probably not going to be starting the year on the active roster. That's a big league deal that essentially just functions the same as like selecting a guy to the 40-man roster is kind of how you can
Mhm.
think about this because he's never been on a 40-man roster. He became a free agent from the Rangers because they wouldn't add him to the 40-man roster, so that made him eligible for minor league free agency. Signed a big league deal with the Brewers, and that basically just adds him onto the 40-man roster, activating that fresh set of 3 option years, which the Brewers will almost certainly use to option him right down to AAA unless he has like a crazy spring training showing. So with that in mind, yeah, you can basically say the Brewers have not spent any money in free agency. And even if Wolfram makes the big league roster, he's making like the big league minimum. So when it eventually happens, do I think it'll be for a pitcher or a hitter? It's tough to say because I think I have my own thoughts on how everything's going to end up looking. I just don't know in what order that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I'm actually gonna jump into his second question because it basically ties into it. His second question is, are the Brewers more likely to trade for a third baseman or sign a third baseman? Which one do you prefer? So what I think is gonna happen and how this ties to the first question is I think the Brewers are almost certainly doing what they've done in past off seasons where they're just kind of waiting out the market at a position because I'm guessing they're looking at this third base market and just seeing that you have all these guys who are like they could be okay, but they don't have amazing track records and they weren't great players in 2024, but they're still more proven commodities than your internal options at third base right now, which are most likely Oliver Dunn and maybe Caleb Durbin at this point. Although if Durbin is on the big league roster and is playing a lot, maybe then Terang moves to short and Ortiz to third. But like you can kind of consider it all the same thing because it's all
Yeah.
one unit. So the Brewers, when they've been in a similar spot in the past, they've kind of just waited out that market and they've kind of just grabbed whoever was left for them at the end of the offseason. Think of like they did kind of something similar with like a Brian Anderson type at third base a couple of years ago. I don't have the date in front of me when he signed. Maybe I should look that up quick just to make sure I'm not conflating that, but I believe he signed closer to the back end of the offseason. Let me get my dates here. Yep, January 23rd. It's actually right about the time that we're in at this moment. But they signed him towards the end of the offseason when spring training was only a couple of weeks away, kind of just the guy who fell to them. So I think they're going to do something similar at third base this year. I know we've talked about Yohan Moncada before
Mhm.
on this show. I've seen some people bring up Paul DeYoung, and I think we mentioned him at some point, but I kind of wrote him off because while he's got the power, I don't think the Brewers are going to want to go for like the low on base, not great swing decision type,
Yeah.
even though he has been a fairly good defender. So Moncada is kind of one that sticks out, but basically like that tier of available infielders. I think what's going to happen is the Brewers are going to continue to wait that market out, and then they're just going to grab whichever one is left on, like your 1 year under $5 million deal. You basically give that guy the key to regular playing time, and maybe things work out and he produces pretty well. If so, great. If he doesn't produce, then maybe you do cut bait pretty quickly and then you just give the runway to a Dunn or a Durbin and see if they can do better.
Yeah.
I think that's the way they're going to go. I don't think they're going to make a trade. I'm just not sure I see a ton of likely options here for the Brewers. I think that they're probably going to perceive it as just more straightforward to just wait that market out and pluck a guy off of there. That's probably the way that I would do it too. But again, it's all dependent on who's available. But I think that's what's going to happen. So to answer the first question, if that happens first, it's going to be a hitter, obviously. But I wouldn't be shocked if they add maybe like another relief piece. They've done that before where they kind of bring
Mhm.
in a reliever late. And it all kind of happens around similar times. So it's hard to say. But I guess if I had to pick one, I would probably say a hitter because that's the one that I really feel good about happening. I don't know how you feel.
Yeah, I agree. I think minimally, I think if there's multiple deals, I think the hitter will be getting more money than the pitcher, whoever they brought in from either, whether the hitter's first or second. I think that would be the one that people would probably view as a legitimate money ad, I guess, in terms of what you're looking at. I think if they add a reliever, it's probably somebody in that 1 to 2, maybe 3 million range. And I would guess the hitter, that somebody who's playing third, would probably be closer to that 5, maybe a little bit higher range if I had to guess. So that's more how I would answer it. I think the hitter is the more likely of the two. But yeah, the order is harder to pick. If they only make one signing, I bet it's going to be a hitter. But if they make multiple, I don't know which one would come first. I think it's more important that I think the bigger signing would be viewed as, or the hitter signing would be viewed as the bigger signing between the two. So that's, I guess, how I would answer that.
Michael asked a similar question. Do you think the Brewers have any MLB level moves left this offseason, or is this the roster? It's basically the answer that we had before that we just wrapped up. We think that's probably the way it's going to unfold in terms of additions the rest of the offseason. Couple of late, not major moves, but kind of some ways to round out the roster. He asks, are you okay with that? I'm fine with it. I don't think this was ever a great free agent market for the Brewers, and that's kind of been a theme over the last several years. These last few markets for them just have not had some of the same opportunities as they had, back when they could trade for Christian Yelich and sign Lorenzo Cain. Like, those kinds of opportunities are always going to be kind of rare for the Brewers, but we especially haven't seen them these past off seasons, or even like when they were able to get Yasmani Grandal and Mike Moustakas on 1-year deals. Like, that hasn't been there either. So I think they did okay. I think it was always going to be kind of tough to replace some of the power they were losing, which we'll get to in a little bit as well. But I think they generally did a fine job. I wouldn't say it was a good offseason. I wouldn't say it was a bad one either. Like, they traded Devin Williams. That was the move they had to make. They did shore up the rotation depth a little bit by adding Cortez into that mix. But otherwise, there wasn't really a lot of turnover either.
No.
I mean, you're losing Willie Adames, but I think there was always an understanding you were never going to be able to fully replace that. It was just do the best you can. I would feel better if they had actually done like anything to give themselves a power floor, which they have not.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm not always one to point fingers when I really can't think of a great way to solve that problem either. So it kind of is what it is.
Yeah, I agree. I think if they stand pat and don't add anybody, one, I would say I bet the Brewers would be more comfortable with that than most of us are kind of expecting. I think internally they probably are hoping to upgrade the Dunn/Durbin type of platoon that I think most of us are expecting. But I also think internally they would feel better about it than a lot of us do. They brought in Dunn for a reason with their trade last year, and they gave him a pretty decent opportunity in April last year. They wanted Durbin in this Devin Williams deal. They're high on both of these guys internally. So I think they would be fine with it, but I think the Brewers aren't dumb. My guess is they would also like to add some power back into the lineup. It's just a matter of if that's available. Can they get it? Is it affordable for what they have in terms of budget this year? That's, I think, the bigger question. And if not, is there a big enough upgrade where you feel like it wouldn't just be solved by giving Dunn and Durbin an opportunity? And I know we have a question about Dunn in a second here, so I'll leave that for that.
Actually, I was going to jump to the power question we got just because we've kind of started talking about this a little bit, and we can kind of circle back around to third base. But Henry asked us over email. This is a very casual fan statement, and I try not to be this guy, but this lineup looks substantially worse on paper than last year, and I would probably have us between the 5th to 7th best NL team as we speak. Do you see this team as one that can finally win a playoff series? To answer the second part of that question, I think any team can win a playoff series if they're in the playoffs. We've talked a lot about just playoff randomness before. I still believe pretty firmly in that. I think there are ways you can cut into the randomness and minimize it a little bit by just being good at certain things. Like, if it, say like the A's somehow squeaked into the playoffs last year as like one of the last wild card teams. Yes, while baseball is random and I would say they absolutely have a chance to win, I would still give them a lower chance than like the Dodgers of winning a playoff series.
Yes.
The randomness exists, which is why I'm giving both of these teams a chance. But because I know the Dodgers are just better, I'm going to assume that the randomness is a little bit less likely to actually affect the series. It won't. I wouldn't believe it will affect the series to the same extent.
Yep.
Because the Dodgers are better, I'm going to predict a less random outcome, but I'm still open to the possibility of the randomness. So, moving on to the first part of that question, the lineup is interesting for me because I just said, like, they haven't done anything to replicate Willie. They have not externally replaced Willie Adames' power. They haven't done a single thing that does that. And again, part of that is they probably were a little boxed in a little bit with what they could realistically do. I think we've touched on it before when we talked about the TV deal. The Brewers can say whatever they want. I think for most of the offseason, they were basically operating with like no money, like none, unless they were going to, significantly raise the budget while losing revenue. And again, I'm not a financial expert. I'm not an expert on that side of the game, but generally speaking, like if this is kind of their general bar that they live in or their, general payroll range, that's probably not going up after you were losing one of your top revenue sources. Like that's just the way it's going to be, regardless of how much spending room you actually think the Brewers or Mark Ananasio have. So a lot of the power production would have to come from internal improvement. And this is where it's really interesting because basically I think this team has a decent power ceiling, but it's just that the power floor has gotten so much lower.
Yeah.
Like Willie Adames he could be a streaky hitter within a season, but you always knew he was going to finish with like 25 or more home runs. He was very consistent season to season in the power department. You don't really have anybody like that now. Now you have a bunch of guys who could probably finish anywhere between like 10 and 35 home runs, depending on how things break. Like a lot of this is going to come down to is Rhys Hoskins going to bounce back a little bit and get back over 30 home runs? How many home runs can a rejuvenated Christian Yelich hit in a full season? Because he probably would have finished with a pretty decent total last year. But then there's also the question of, well, is the more powerful version of Christian Yelich actually back for good now after he underwent back surgery?
Right.
Then there's William Contreras, who hits the ball in like the upper tier of hitters in terms of how hard he hits it, but he can't hit the ball off the ground. Can he like just make even marginal improvements in that field? I wrote about this a few days ago as well. I compared him. It's not a perfect comparison, but I compared him like to Gunnar Henderson with Baltimore. It's not perfect because Henderson's a lefty, and you can talk about the trends of pulling as a lefty versus pulling as a righty. But still, like there are a lot of similarities here. He hits the ball a little harder than Contreras, but otherwise they're very similar in terms of quality of contact. They're very similar in terms of how often they put the ball in play, how often they chase, how often they walk. They're also very similar in that neither one of them are big pull guys. Like they're very balanced spray chart guys. The only and neither one of them are huge fly ball guys either. The only difference is Henderson, like he basically, if you look at like a distribution of his launch angles, it's like shifted like basically like one tick over. Like if you divide it up into 5-degree increments, it shifted like one tick over in the positive direction. So it's not a substantial like shift to his approach or anything, but it ends up being a pretty meaningful one. And like, that's the comp I made for Contreras. So basically think of it as like, if he gets his ground ball rate even down to like 45% instead of like 52% or whatever it was last year, it was one of the highest rates in baseball. That shift alone could be enough to get him up to 30 plus home runs.
Yeah.
So it comes down to how much power you're getting out of Hoskins, how much you're getting out of Yelich, how much are you getting out of Contreras. Garrett Mitchell's a big wild card too. We've talked a lot about how we're not Garrett Mitchell believers really. I think we still fall into that category because we are concerned about both the hole at the top of the zone with velocity, but then also the fact that he doesn't elevate the ball either. He's another guy who hits it on the ground a lot, but he's another guy who, the thing I will not deny about him is he's got a ton of raw power, and I still believe out of all of like the athletes the Brewers have in their outfield, he is the most physically gifted one. Maybe Churrio's ahead of him, but in terms of like these other guys who it's very easy to kind of group into that same category, I think he's the best one because he's just the way he's built and the strength and the mobility and all this stuff, the power speed combo. It's really incredible. His floor is so low for me. I don't know how likely he is to tap into it because of his shortcomings. I was talking to Kurt Hogue about this. He's just such a strange player because in every facet of the game, he's either like really, really good at it or he's really, really bad at it. Like he's really fast. He's a really good defender. He's got elite raw power. He's really bad at making contact at the top of the zone. He's really bad at elevating the ball. He's like, it's just kind of hard to wrap your head around. Like it's hard to identify things that he's just like okay at.
Yeah.
He's either really good at it or he's really bad at it. So like there's a wide range of outcomes there as well, but that kind of encapsulates how the power production in this offense looks right now. Like there's just such a wide range of outcomes. There's a world in where they're a pretty good power team. There's also a world in which they're one of the worst power teams in baseball this year. And it's because they have so many of these guys who like they have the ability to do it. You just don't know if it's going to happen. Like there are some things that need to happen to get them there. And I think that is going to be one of the interesting challenges for Al LaBeouf this year in his first year as the big league hitting coach. And this is where I kind of just start to speculate like what went into the decision behind shaking things up there. Maybe they do think that he's the guy who can kind of get some of these players to take that step forward. He was highly regarded as a hitting coach in the Brewers minor league system for several years. So maybe he's the guy who they think, working with Connor Dawson, they can get more of that power production out of those guys. Because if they're able to like get decent improvement in the power department for like 3 to 5 guys, that's going to add up pretty quickly. And all of a sudden you got a team where, you have a bunch of guys who are up over 20 home runs. Like, yeah, you're going to be sitting pretty in that category. So there's just such a wide range here that makes it really hard to answer. But that is going to have a pretty big ripple effect on, yes, number one, how many games are they going to win? But also, can they win in the playoff series? Because, like, hitting home runs in the playoffs is important. This is why the Brewers lost in the playoffs very quickly against the Diamondbacks a couple of years ago, because they got a lot of hits, but none of them were for extra bases. And then you look at this wild card series, the Brewers almost won because they hit 2 big home runs. And then they lost because the Mets hit 1 more big home run. Like, this is generally how it works in the playoffs. If you want to cut into the randomness, this is a good way to do it. Yeah. Because home runs are like one of the only automatics in baseball. You hit the ball high and hard and far and hit it over 400 feet, that's going to score a run every single time. Everything else, it gets a little bit more complicated. There's a wider range of outcomes, from other batted balls or other swings or what have you.
Yeah. I honestly have nothing. I think the only thing, you mentioned Churrio when you were talking about Mitchell, but you didn't mention him as one of the guys who could also take a step in that power department. I mean, we saw 20, which was pretty impressive considering where he was at heading into June. I believe it may have only been 5 heading into June. It was around 5 or 6, I think. And he had a big power output afterwards, but he's also a guy who I think still has physical development left where, some of the power might be coming just in that way by getting a little stronger as he continues to mature. Again, he was 20. So he's one of the guys who, while he hit 20, it just wouldn't surprise me to see a jump into the 30s at all. But at the same time, he's going to be 21 and it's going to be his second year and pitchers are going to adjust. So it wouldn't be shocking if there was a step back or he held pretty much the same, just maybe in a different, maybe not a bad first half into a great second half. Maybe it's just more spread out throughout the season. But yeah, there's still a wide range for him too. But he's also he's one of the guys who could add to that power department for sure.
We'll circle back to the third base question. Steven asks us, I was just looking at Willie Castro of the Twins as a third base option, but the more I looked at it, It seemed like he's just Oliver Dunn after a breakout. Why not just let Oliver Dunn have the chance to break out? Am I crazy? No, you're not crazy. I still like Oliver Dunn a lot for the raw tools. He's a little bit like Mitchell in that he's got the big swing and miss. But I've been on the Ollie Dunn train a little more than the Mitchell train because I think Ollie Dunn makes way better swing decisions. He's got an elite eye. He's not going to chase anything. Mitchell also got a lot better on that front this year. So I should give him credit for that. But also, like, Dunn doesn't have the concerns about, like, not elevating the ball. Like, he was a huge line drive hitter in the minor leagues. Always someone who showed the ability to hit for more power as a pro. So that's why I'm it's easier for me to believe in him than it is in Mitchell, even though in a lot of ways they are kind of like the profile of like really, really great raw tools, just a lot of issues that are holding them back from fully realizing them. But as far as the comparison to Castro, I get what you're saying, but I would say that Dunn probably has a significantly higher ceiling than Willie Castro. I think there's a lot more power potential here. Like Willie Castro, I pulled up the numbers. He does not hit the ball very hard.
Mm-hmm.
He's also not a big walk guy. Like if things pan out for Ollie Dunn, he should be a guy who hits the ball really hard, gets on base a ton, draws a lot of walks, has fairly good speed, plays a good defense at third base. Like I'm not saying this is going to happen, but there's like close to star ceiling for Ollie Dunn if everything breaks right based on the things that he can do and the things he's good at. Again, I'm not saying it's going to happen. I think that's like a pretty high outcome, like a high percentile outcome. But I think there's way more in the tank for Dunn than there is for Willie Castro. That's probably the best way to say it. So this is where I'm really curious to see how the Brewers view this. Obviously, they like Ollie Dunn. They plucked him off the potential Rule 5 chopping block from the Phillies. They gave him a decent run at third base at the start of last year. So I am curious how likely they think he is to actually tap into that ceiling, because if he gets anywhere close to it, yeah, he would absolutely be good enough to play third base at the very least every day against righties. And then you try to mix and match him with someone else against lefties. But he is still very much a breakout candidate for this year, and I think he's kind of flying under the radar for some people. And I do wonder if that is part of the reason why, maybe there are other options that the Brewers see and they're like, we don't think it's worth going after this guy because we have Oliver Dunn.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think we've both been in agreement on Dunn for a while. It's not hard to see or to forecast like a season where he puts up like 3+ WAR at third base because he hits some homers, he draws walks, he steals bases, and he graded out fantastically at third base last year when he was playing there defensively. So the swing and miss needs to be way, way better than it was in his sample last year. I think in an ideal world, I would still like to see him have some time in AAA. Obviously, the Brewers were hoping for that last year, and then he ended up getting hurt and missing the rest of the season, and they really only got to see probably a couple weeks in AAA. It'd be nice to get him that experience, but the breakout potential is absolutely real. And I agree with Jack where I don't know that I would comp him to Willie Castro as like his high end outcome overall, but I think like a solid Oliver Dunn season could be a similar overall output to what Castro did for the Twins last year, which was just a really solid player overall for them. Especially, I think he had a great first half. I don't know if he finished the season very well. I think he was on the All-Star team last year, but I don't know that he had a great second half. Either way, like you can see the general value that he could bring, I think could be similar. I think it would just be done in different ways for sure. But yeah, that's kind of the thing for me when I look at a lot of the options. I do think that Dunn has a higher ceiling than the vast majority of the people who would be available. It's just a matter of, can you get a much safer floor and somebody that you feel really confident can just give you a solid output and you can trust it. And then if Dunn comes along and that guy's struggling, then great. We put Dunn in and we let him finish the season, but maybe a little bit more of a floor heading into the season is probably what they'd be hoping for out of whoever they would bring in there.
You said like you could see a world of like a 3-1 season from Dunn. I think if things crack right, I would say like 4 WAR.
Oh yeah, I mean,
Because like remember like Travis Shaw had like a 3.5 win or almost
yeah,
4 win season
true.
at third base, and that was a guy who hit like 30 home runs and was a good defender over there. Like I actually think that's an okay comp for Dunn, and I would say because Dunn has hit the ball so hard, I think he's capable of even more than that. Again, it's just a matter of if he figures it out, and he'd be doing it with kind of an unconventional frame. He's a
Mm-hmm.
shorter guy, but I think that's in there. So again, like I think he's a really toolsy player. It is kind of like the Mitchell syndrome of like, okay, how likely is it to be realized? But I do think like the offensive ceiling in particular is more likely to be realized than it is for Mitchell. Maybe not dramatically so, but a little bit more so. But I don't just write him off. I'm not saying that I want him at third base to start the year. I agree with you. I think that's really what he's missing is the added development time in AAA. But I don't think you're like insane to think that he could help you potentially pretty substantially at third base this year. So, like the Brewers are not crazy for having him in the mix. I don't think people should be writing him off right now. We'll go to another question from Henry, who said he feels pretty strongly that Pat Murphy will be leading off Bryce Terang, at least to start the season. Do you think that this is the best option? How would you construct the lineup with the roster as it stands today? Spencer, do you want to start on this one first?
Sure. I agree that I think we're going to see Bryce Terang leading off. I would disagree with that being the decision currently, but I think that's what we're going to see. I think everybody knows that Murph likes Bryce Terang a lot, and obviously the first half version that we got of Bryce Terang last year offensively, at least in terms of production, would have been a fine leadoff hitter. I think what we saw in the overall production is probably closer to his true talent and what you're more likely to get spread out over the whole season. So I guess my preference would be to not go into the season with that being your leadoff hitter. Um, Funny enough, as much as I worry about the strikeouts, I think I would rather see Garrett Mitchell leading off, especially since he started drawing a lot more walks last year, and there's the same level of speed and everything else that you would get with Terang from Mitchell. So there's a lot of people I would prefer at the top of the order. I'd be fine with Churio doing it again. I'd be fine with even Yelich coming back and doing it again, but we'll see. I don't worry too much about lineup construction in general. So to be honest, I haven't really looked too deep into it, but generally, I think Yelich and Churio are probably your 2 and 3 hitters in your ideal lineup. And then if you get the good version of Reese, maybe he's the 4. William should probably be in that group too. So maybe, honestly, no. I kind of like Churio, Yelich, William as my top if I were forming it just off. I'm doing this off the top of my head, so I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, but then I'd probably go Reese and then I'd start building from there. I don't worry too much about it beyond that, to be honest. But that is where it would get interesting is 5 because you're missing some of that power, and that's usually a power spot in the lineup. And that's kind of where you're starting to run out of it. You might put a Mitchell there if he's not leading off because he has some pop, but there's also the strikeouts. I don't know. It'll be an interesting lineup to see them fill out. I really haven't put enough thought into it to give a very good answer here, though, I don't think.
I think that no matter how you slice it, somebody needs to take a step forward power-wise for
Yes.
this lineup to come together, no matter how you want to construct it, because basically the way it stands right now, if it's kind of status quo for power production, is you're either putting a bad hitter in the leadoff spot or you're batting somebody in the middle of the order who does not hit for power. Like it's kind of one or the other. It's like, okay, well, if we want to hit Sal Frelick or Bryce Terang or whomever at the top, okay, that can, help us push someone like Mitchell with more power potential or someone like Churio with more power potential. That helps us push them down. And now you have like a 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 or 6 who has some pop, but it's coming at the expense of now you're giving more at bats at the top of the order to bad hitters.
Yeah.
If you do it the other way around and you say, okay, let's put like Churio, keep putting Churio at the top like they did for good chunks of last year, put an actual good hitter at the top, which is, I don't care about lineup construction, but if I had to like pick a way to do it, that's probably what I would do. Just get
Yes.
more at bats for your good hitters. Everybody's going to bat in every feasible situation throughout the course of a long season. Like that's just kind of how it works. There's so many different, combinations, so many different ways that things can unfold, so many different sequences that can happen in a game, let alone a season. But then there is also the point, kind of the counter argument of if you put, like Jackson Chura at the top of the order, now Sal Frelick's batting fifth, and he's going to inevitably come up in some spots where you have guys on base and, he's going to hit a 65-mile-an-hour rollover to second base. So the only way that this whole lineup really comes together is if, like I said, you get guys who take a step forward power-wise. I think that's going to kind of render a lot of this discussion moot if that happens. All the pieces are just going to kind of fall into place. If it doesn't happen, basically Murphy's in kind of a no-win situation, and I'm not going to rag on him no matter what he does. I think we were probably harder on him than most people in the Brewers media sphere, but I think the one thing we never really criticized him for at any point was lineup construction.
No.
Because that's not something we care about a whole lot. Like it is what it is. And if you're faced with a lineup full of hitters who just generally don't hit for a ton of power, there's just no good way to put that lineup together. So I'm going to be, I'm not really going to make a big stink about that. But again, really, the answer here to any lineup question is more guys need to hit for power and everything's going to be okay.
Yep.
If not, you're kind of in a suboptimal situation no matter what decisions you try to make. Those are all the questions we'll take for this week. We didn't quite get to all of them. Maybe we'll carry a couple of them over to our next episode. But for now, we're going to move on to the portion of this week's show that Spencer has been dying to get to. The international signing period opened a couple days ago, and the Brewers announced, 19 players, or was it 29? 29 players. I had the first digit wrong. So Spencer's going to walk you through some of these players. In fact, is it all of these players?
It's not. It is not all of them. I'm not going to go through all of them.
Okay, most of the players. He's going to walk you through the highlights in this special edition of Spencer's Minor League Sandbox. Take it away.
All right. Well, first, I do want to answer one question because I'll answer it quickly. Steven asked, 4 Brewers made the Baseball Prospectus Top 101. Jesus Mate at 35, Jefferson Cairo at 61, Cooper Pratt at 63, and Jacob Mizorowski at 65. Any surprises, he asks. The only surprise for me is actually how high they had Mike Bovee, because they put him in their next 10, basically meaning he was a top 111 player for them. I'm a big Bovee fan. I was a huge fan of him in the draft. I wanted the Brewers to draft him. I thought they might. But I was surprised that he was that high. I like the bat a lot. I don't know that there's going to be much base running value, and I don't know that there's going to be a ton of defensive value. So that worries me a little bit. But if he hits and he adds the power that I think he's capable of, he could end up at first base and being a pretty solid first baseman defensively. So that's the only question we got there. Henry Bishop did ask about the international period. So I'll just jump into that. The question was basically, can you dive into the international class, which I was planning to do anyway. So you read my mind, Henry. I'll talk about some hitters first. I'll go through probably 7 or 8 of them here. I put a thread out on Twitter of most of the guys that I was at least able to find a video on over the course of like the last 6 months. I was digging pretty deep this year. Normally I just wait for the classes to start coming out, but I was trying to find players. There's always hints on social media of who they're going to be signing with. And I found a lot of Brewers who are going to be signing. So it gave me a chance to actually dig into them a little bit rather than just reacting to them signing. The first one in their top signing was Kenny Fenelon, an outfielder out of the Dominican. He is said to have plus power. Very, very good athlete. I know Fangraphs actually comped him to somewhat of like a Mike Cameron if he can hit his peak. He's said to be a pretty good defender in center, good speed, but huge raw power. He gets to the power in game 2, but there are concerns about the hitability and his bat to ball skills. So we'll have to keep an eye on the strikeout rate more than anything in the DSL. You kind of have to pick out things to watch when they're in the DSL. For me, it'll be the strikeout rate for Fenelon. Christopher Acosta is their next signing, their next highest bonus at $1.1 million. He is a shortstop. He's really, the Brewers international director really hyped up the defense, said he's got some of the best hands they've ever seen. The defense grades out really well. The little video I've seen, he does look incredibly smooth. The swing to me is a little long and a little slow, and the bat doesn't have a lot of power behind it, which normally if you're going to have a little bit of a longer swing, you would see some power come out of it. So I worry a little bit about the bat, but the glove should carry him. And if he can create at least decent offensive output throughout the minors and climbing the ladder, then I think there could be something there. The defense is supposedly that good. And like I said, the video is very impressive. Henry did mention in his question that Braylon Antunes is his favorite player in the class, and I am inclined to agree on that one. Antunes is pretty far and away my favorite of these three, and really of all of them that signed yesterday. He is from the exact same city as Jackson Chourio in Venezuela. He plays center field. He has really, really good bat speed, which, again, you don't want to comp him to Chourio, but a lot of the things that you hear about him are similar to what you heard when Chourio was signing. Now, obviously, Chourio developed quite a bit in pro ball, and he has to take that route still. But Antunes, very, very twitchy. I really like his swing. I think he's just got a ton of ability defensively in the outfield. He's getting used to it. He, again, like Chourio, moved from the outfield or from the infield recently to the outfield. And there's just a lot to like. I actually think the swing gives me a little bit more Willy Adames vibes than a guy like Chourio, but it's a really, really nice profile. And for me, he's the one with the highest upside overall from this class. Some other names of note, I don't know how to pronounce this. I'm guessing it's Isaias Chavez. He signed for almost $500,000. He is a catcher who's said to have a really, really strong arm. Some raw power. It kind of reminds me of how they would describe Jefferson Quero when he signed. Now, again, there's a ton of development to go. Luis Corobo last year was another guy with a similar profile, and he showed some of the things that you would like to see. So I'm guessing the Brewers will hope to see a similar output from Chavez. A couple outfielders, Gerlin Payano and Erix Rivero, both signed for around $400,000 and $300,000. Payano is interesting. He was seen as like a really big uptick guy by Baseball America. He grew 5 inches since teams started scouting him. And in the meantime, he was developing quite a bit of power. So that showed up where teams first started scouting him. He didn't have much pop, and then he grew into the power. He's already a plus runner. He has a very good arm. So if he ends up having to move out of center, they think he would be just fine and right. When I watch the swing, I think there's a little bit too much hand movement, more than I would want, but it's also a very athletic swing, and it seems like something that could get cleaned up. And Jesus Mate had the same thing last year, and that obviously did not end up being a problem for him at all. Rivero is really hard to find information on, to be honest, so I don't have much on him. I just know he was one of their higher bonuses, so it seems like somebody that's pretty noteworthy. Alexander Frias, he is another outfielder, huge arm. His brother is Luis Frias. He actually is in the Guardians organization. He's on their 40-man. He's pitched in the majors for a couple different organizations now. Alexander has a huge arm as well, so there are some scouts who think if hitting doesn't work out, he could end up on the mound and end up being somewhat of a flamethrower on the mound. Not sure how secondaries or anything would look at that point, but they think he could have the arm to just make that move and at least give him something to fall back on. But there's pretty big power in the bat currently. He's pretty line drive oriented, so he hasn't been able to get to the power super consistently in game, but some of the video I posted on Twitter, you can see he plays with a lot of emotion. He had a huge bat flip in one of them. And he does, when he connects, it goes. He's got some of the bigger, like, raw power exit velocities in the entire class for the Brewers, and doesn't look it. He's more slight than you would think, so he generates a lot of bat speed as well. And then the last name I'm going to talk about, and he's one of the lower bonuses that we know, Christian Montilla. He got $35,000 to sign. When I watch his video, I don't know what it is. I really like him. I thought he was going to be a bigger bonus guy when I was just kind of looking through videos in the last 6 months. I think he's got fantastic hands defensively. He's got a really, really smooth demeanor in the field. And I also think his swing looks pretty good. And it's just, to me, he's got a lot of the things you would look for in a just an underrated prospect. He's not the biggest guy, but he's got a really smooth lefty swing. Like I said, I don't know that there will be a ton of power down the line, but I think he's going to hit. And I don't think he'll be a guy who strikes out much just with how the swing looks and everything else. So he is one of the sleepers for me. Nobody's really talked about him. This is more just completely my opinion. But he's one I'll be watching and I'll be paying a lot of attention to in the DSL next year. And then moving to the pitching side, I've just got 4 names. Yuri Ramirez is, by all accounts, their biggest pitching signing. He's getting $210,000 to sign, which is one of the biggest bonuses the Brewers have given a pitching international signing in quite a while. They do not go that high very often. It's usually 100,000 or lower, maybe up to 150. And I know the international director talked about him yesterday and said the way he talked about him, Kurt Hogue wrote up an article about some of his quotes, and I believe Adam McKelvey did as well. But the way he talked about him, they don't normally talk about pitchers that they just signed like that. So it was notable. He's up to 95 already. He's very skinny. It seems like somebody who could just put on some weight and add some more velocity just by getting stronger and maturing. He has good feel for a changeup. He has good feel for his breaking ball. He's been throwing strikes by all accounts in their games that they've been putting on. And he loves to mess with timing as well. He's got like a mature approach on the mound. Now, he likes to he'll quick pitch. He'll do the hanging the leg up and down type thing. The video I have out there is pretty fun. He also very clearly pitches with a lot of emotion on the mound. He has one of the videos on there, he turns around and basically like flexes towards the outfield after striking somebody out. And one of them, he kind of points at the guy and then does like the Abner Uribe finger gun thing that he did at one point earlier this year. So we'll have to keep an eye on him in case there's, some of the extracurriculars that you sometimes worry about with someone who pitches like that. But by all accounts, he's pretty mature in every other fashion. So it might just be something that helps him get going, which plenty of pitchers have that. Plenty of major league pitchers behave like that. It's just the only thing that stood out to me as something that I would maybe worry a little bit about. Luis Aguayo out of Mexico, another righty. Not sure what his bonus is, but he's actually pitched 9 innings in the Mexican Winter League as a 16-year-old. I believe he was the youngest pitcher in the league. Another guy who's been up to 94 on his fastball. It seems to be a 2-seam. From what I can tell, he might be throwing both a 2-seam and a 4-seam. Pretty interesting looking changeup. I think Baseball America, they said it's an advanced changeup with plus potential. And the other part about him is that he seems to have really good command, even though he ended up walking 6 in his 9 innings in the Mexican Winter League. But I think it's important to note that he was 12 years younger than the league average there. He was facing a lot of experienced major leaguers even in that league. So he had 10 strikeouts in those 9 innings as well. So the stuff is pretty good. I think he's another one where, to me, he might be the most polished coming out. I don't know that he has much projection left. He's pretty well built for a 16-year-old or 17-year-old now. But for me, one of the other ones definitely to watch from the pitching side, Enrique Velasquez is out of Venezuela. He's signing for $100,000. He is another one who's been in that 90 to 93 range. I think the breaking ball, he throws a curve and a slider, both look pretty good on video. I think he's one that has projectability left. I think he's got some velo left in the tank. And from what I could find, it seems like he's a little bit newer to pitching than the other one. So it'll be interesting to see him develop. And the final one is, I don't know if it's Dustin or Diustin Mayorkin out of Nicaragua. He is another $100,000 signing. He's one that I found early on and thought was pretty interesting. And I know Prospect Tilt on Twitter, who's a very good follow and does a lot of really good work, actually called him out as somebody that he would watch as well. But yeah, Mayorkin has multiple off-speed pitches. He throws the breaking balls. He throws a changeup, and he's also sitting in the low 90s currently with what I think, again, looks more like a 2-seam fastball. Another guy who pitched at some level of like a semi-pro type level. He had games that were televised down there, so there's some video from that, but I can't really tell what the league is exactly. But another one, they love to go into Nicaragua and get some of these pitchers. They've had some success with it. They've had some pretty interesting prospects come out of there recently, and he's one that I'll definitely be watching as well. So 4 pitchers, 2, 4, 6, 8 hitters. Like I said, that's only 12 of the 29. Some of the threads on Twitter have some more names, but we're already at about 2 hours and 15 minutes. And frankly, with the Uecker thing today, I didn't have time to put it all together like I probably would have if we didn't have that going on. But I'm much rather talk for 30 minutes about Bob Uecker than about the international signing period. There are not many things I would put over the international signing period, but Bob Uecker is absolutely one of them. So no problem with us going that direction instead. But yeah, that's kind of where I would wrap it up. I think it's a good class again. I think the Brewers are probably going to see a couple guys who pop up out of this class. Baseball America ranked, or not ranked, but they said the Brewers were in their top 5 most interesting classes. They're getting really good at this. So at this point, a lot of it is that I trust that they're finding some of these guys, but also I really do like what I saw on video from a good chunk of these guys. And I think all of them have some pretty interesting ceilings. It's obviously these are 16, 17-year-old kids. So the difference between the floor and the ceiling is massive, but they're all pretty interesting. And even some of the guys I didn't mention, I mean, I certainly would not rule them out either. There is a lot of untapped potential within the 29 players who signed. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they do after this, because I have a feeling they have a decent amount of pool space left, like probably close to 750,000 or $1 million. It makes me wonder, just throwing it out there, if they might try to make a trade with whatever team is going after Roki Sasaki and maybe try and pull in somebody with a little bit more of an established prospect presence, but we'll find out. I don't know exactly where they landed. Not every bonus is reported, so it'll be more up to, I don't really know exactly where they're at, but just on my kind of quick math, it seems like they might have a good chunk left over. So that's something I'll be watching for. I would love for a Brewers trade in terms of some slot money, because as fun as it is to talk, and we've made it over 2 hours numerous times, it would be fun to have a little bit more of actual transactional news for Jack and I to discuss. So Jack, I'm done. You can pop back in if you'd like. But yeah, we haven't done a minor league sandbox in quite a while, because there really just hasn't been a ton to talk about. So I took advantage. I talked for a while.
You've been doing your offshoot episode.
This is true.
So in a way, you have been doing a minor league sandbox. It's gotten even more spotlight now.
True.
Not sharing time with me and my musings.
Correct.
I think that's going to be all for us this week. Thank you all for listening. We're all going through what's probably going to be one of the tougher times in franchise history right now. So I don't really have a whole lot else to say. Just rest in peace to Bob Uecker. Thank you for all the memories. You'll never be forgotten. Legendary broadcaster, larger than life figure. I don't think it's fully going to hit either until we get into the 2025 season.
Yeah.
And people realize he's not there. He's not on the airwaves. I would be willing to guess you're probably going to have another wave of emotion that comes once we get there, and the tribute that he's inevitably going to receive at the home opener. It's going to be a tough moment for everybody, I think, again, but there's not a whole lot else you can say. Like I said at the onset of this episode, it's natural to be sad that it's over, but you can't let that stop you from, being happy and feeling blessed that you got to be around to experience a lot of this as well. So
yeah.
On that note, take care, everybody. We'll talk to you again in a couple weeks.